Good afternoon. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for sticking around. Standing room only is always exciting. My name is Lena Matson, as you heard, and I'm a reference librarian in the Geography and Map Division at the Library of Congress. My fellow reference librarians and I work with researchers to help them make the most use of our collections, whether they're with us in the reading room or anywhere else in the world. So I'm here today to show you some maps and to tell you about some ways that maps make someone's imagined version of reality into a reference point that feels real, accurate, and possible to navigate. I'm also going to show you some of the ideas and innovations people have had over the centuries that make the maps we know today possible. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about where I work. So, the Library of Congress Geography and Map Division, as was just teased, is the largest map library in the world. Our collections have been growing steadily since 1800 and now comprise about 6 million cartographic items. Those include single-sheet maps, multi-sheet maps, atlases, globes, and other kinds of three-dimensional objects that you might not expect to find maps on, such as animal horn and even chocolate. We hold maps of Earth, ranging from the whole world to a single city block, as well as maps beyond Earth of outer space and of imaginary places. Our oldest map was made around the year 1350, and we are still constantly collecting new materials all the time. If you want to visit, our collections and our public reading room are housed in the Madison Building, which is the newest of the 3 Library of Congress buildings on Capitol Hill. The reading room is open Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 5 o'clock p.m. We're open to the public. You just need a free Library of Congress reader card to get in and request some maps. Just be patient when you do, because as you can see from the graphic on this slide, our stacks are about the same size as the Washington Monument on its side. So fetching items can take us a while, depending especially how much exercise we've already done that day. Now, this is the first map that I want to show you today. It is a Marshall Islands stick chart representing the western Rollick chain of the Marshall Islands. This particular chart was made in the 1920s, but this tradition of chart making is ancient, and this is one of the oldest kinds of maps that we know to exist. Apologies, I seem to have glued my notes together. Now, the large shell near the center of this image represents an atoll, and the herringbone design represents ocean swells caused by the northeast trade winds. But this chart is not made to represent a known geographic scale, such as you would find if you used electronic tools to navigate in this region. Instead, it actually represents time, which was much more important to the Pacific travelers navigating by canoe between land masses. In this part of the world, islands are low and not visible from far away, so sailors couldn't rely on spotting their destination from a long way off, or on triangulating distances from a set horizon point, the way that cartographers in the European tradition would. Instead, navigators observed star patterns, wave and swell patterns, and bird flight to gauge locations. They would also use song to judge the passage of time, hence the importance of time for these kinds of charts, and thus to determine the distances that they had traveled already between places. These stick charts were also highly individual. They were not mass-produced. They were used by students of navigation for training and for memorization, and then that was when their purpose had been served. They were not traveled with. They were simply a teaching tool to help the navigators hone their observation skills. This way of thinking and moving on the ocean is so different from map-based navigation that most of us in this room would know, especially those of us old enough to remember keeping road map books in the passenger seat pockets of the car, or printing out turn-by-turn MapQuest directions to get to our friends' houses back in the day. But those examples and this one all still fit my favorite definition of a map. They are all an abstraction of three-dimensional space to visualize a compacted version of perceived reality. There isn't a reason that we have to make maps look the way they do now on our phone's Maps app. Over the past 800 years or so, we have collectively decided as a society how to display visual instructions for moving around in space, using a European-derived system of grid coordinates and mathematical calculations that don't really exist on the Earth. We just invented a system we could standardize, and then we declared it the standard. Along the way, it has been revised and refined many times, and cartographers have made lots of innovations along the way to making the maps that we know and use today. This map is a good example of an early prototype of the kinds of maps we're familiar with now. It's what we call a Portolan chart, which is the name for sailing charts made between approximately the 13th and 18th centuries that rely on rhumb lines, which are the navigational lines you see that crisscross each other. And the maps emphasize coastlines and water feature details instead of anything on land. These are the first known maps, at least in the European context, that try to translate a view of what the surface of the Earth looks like in a recognizable way on paper. Before that, in Europe and the West, maps were not meant to be geographically accurate because they were used for conceptual understandings of the Earth and places on the Earth in relation to the heavens. They weren't used for navigation. But as explorers began to travel hundreds and thousands of miles from their homes and the local navigators they would have encountered in the usual ports to help them the rest of the way, a way of documenting these distances became necessary. First, the directions were written, but visualizing them proved to be more helpful, as many of us experience today when we try to follow instructions for putting furniture together, for example. Portolan charts evolved as the navigational bearings over distances became standardized as these rhumb lines I pointed out, and the inlets and the crags of the coastlines became standardized with these bold colors and the perpendicular writing for the names of the ports and other features that they would encounter in new places to them. However, as you can see from this example, which was made in 1568, they were still not what we would consider accurate today. This Portolan chart shows the east coast of what we now call North America, and you can generally recognize the features. There's Cuba and the Caribbean islands, Florida, the coastline up to New England, and then Atlantic Canada. However, as you're undoubtedly aware, Maine and eastern Canada are not this large, they're not that sideways, and Florida is not that tiny. The ports and settlements along the coast are transcribed with painstaking detail, but that elongates the coastline almost past the point of recognition in order to fit everything in. The other key element of this map that makes it a precursor to the maps we know today is that it emphasizes territorial control. The sneaky thing about maps is that they look authoritative because we've been conditioned culturally to believe that they are. So a cartographer with a motive can make you believe anything they want you to simply by how they lay out boundaries and other details. There's been a recent example in the news of how important this continues to be to this day. If you've been following the announcement a few weeks ago that the African Union would be working with international organizations to emphasize the equal Earth projection over the Mercator projection that's used most commonly for maps today, because the Mercator projection shows Africa as much smaller and less prominent than it truly is. The cartographer who made this map back in the 1560s was Portuguese, and the words on this map are written in Portuguese, but he worked for the French court. How do I know that? There are two Spanish flags in the interior of the country, and I know they're very faint, but you'll just have to believe me if you can't see them from where you are. And they show Spain's presence at this time in what's now the southeastern United States. But the very big flag that's easiest to see is a crossed fleur-de-lis pattern over what's now eastern Canada. The flag shows off the area where Jacques Cartier had first landed in Canada 20 years earlier and described the parts of it that had been claimed by France. On the other hand, the cartographer who made this map, like many of the first cartographers to map the Americas, never set foot here. Cartographers in those days worked with notes, descriptions, and draft drawings of various qualities that European sailors brought home, and they put these sources all together to make visually pleasing navigational aids that pushed their version of who was dominant and what was important about these unknown lands. Now, here are some much later maps made not quite 40 years ago that follow the scientific standards of map making we understand today. We're looking at Florida again, and this time with standard measurements so that Florida's size, shape, and distances between locations look much more accurate and precise, especially to our eyes. What's interesting, though, is that these two maps were made at the same time by the same government organization, the U.S. Geological Survey, but they use all the same information to emphasize completely different things. The map on the left looks like any general map you've ever seen, maybe with a few extra details. You can see Florida's cities, highways, natural features, and if you look really closely, some topographic contour lines that show you the heights of features on land. You can also very clearly see the ocean depths shown by deepening bands of blue as you get further away from the coastal shallows. Meanwhile, the map on the right uses another major technological innovation in map making, Landsat imagery. These colorful shapes and patterns come from satellite images, specifically multispectral scans from Landsat satellites. These detect light in ranges of wavelengths beyond what the human eye can see, giving us rainbow-colored indicators of deep water in black, mines in white, crops in red and orange, swamps in green, and pine forests in blue. This map is arguably the most scientifically accurate map we can produce, one that's based on actual images taken of the Earth from space. But this is really still yet another interpretation of our world. Even if you've never been to Florida, you know that the ocean there isn't black and that agricultural areas full of farms and plants aren't red. But you can still tell that this is supposed to be Florida because it matches other standards you've seen, like having that recognizable panhandle shape and peninsula shape of how you're used to identifying Florida on maps. I showed you these maps of Florida, as well as the much earlier map of Florida and the East Coast, and the Pacific Stick Chart, because I wanted to be very clear that all maps have to make compromises, simplifying some kinds of data and exaggerating others in order to make an interpretation of the world that feels real, recognizable, and useful. Even when using scientifically rigorous and technologically advanced maps, you have to be creative and use your imagination to see things that may not be as you expected, which I think becomes even more apparent when you look beyond Earth to other worlds. Even before we got Landsat images, the space race that launched the first satellites in 1957 and took Americans to the moon in 1969 also made all kinds of new mapping possible, thanks to unprecedented types and amounts of data gathering. Suddenly, like the cartographers of hundreds of years ago, 20th century cartographers could make maps of far-off places that they would never be able to visit and verify in person. This map, published in 1965, was based on data gathered from flyby missions launched by NASA earlier in the decade. We have much more data now and clearer visuals on Mars now than we did then, but the map makers made beautiful views of what they did know decades ago about the planet, and they filled in the rest with depth and shadow. Even when not every detail about a place is known, map makers can still build worlds that we experience as very real. You can still look at this and feel like you're seeing Mars as it would be if you could look at it more closely. As we celebrate here at the National Book Festival, we can also experience imaginary places as real that technically aren't. Many of the authors here today and books being celebrated have created worlds that we won't find on any physical journey, but that we feel we know and understand. One of our most beloved collections in the Geography and Map Division is our Literary Maps collection, which includes this map from Robert Louis Stevenson's classic story, Treasure Island. The map has a very believable-looking landmass as the fictional Treasure Island, with illustrated vignettes featuring memorable scenes from the book in the supposed places where they happened. The natural features of the island make sense for an imitation Caribbean island, as do the distances, and it all lines up with the book to create an island that feels like it could be real. Maps can teach us all kinds of interesting things, and I think these literary maps show a classic principle of literature, which is that if you're going to create a world, it has to feel like a real or at least possible world, emotionally if in no other way. That's all I have for you today. I'm going to leave you with two links that I have up here on the slide for our Ask a Librarian service and for our digital collections. If you're having trouble seeing, the Ask a Librarian is ask.loc.gov and then /map-geography. And if you don't get all that, ask.loc.gov is a great start. You'll find the rest. And then to find maps online, you can just go to our website, loc.gov/maps, and you'll be able to find things in our digital collections. While you're here today, please also come visit us. The Geography and Map Division has a table right by this pavilion in the LC Adams section. We have lots of fun handouts. We have more maps that you can look through. Map facsimiles, of course. We didn't bring the real ones, but they're still a lot of fun, we promise. And plenty of things that you can take home. And at 2 o'clock, we're having a craft hour where you can make globes. This is especially a good activity for all the kids and kids at heart in the audience. So hopefully we'll see you there. And now I am ready to take questions.
When you spoke of Portolan charts, where does the word Portolan come from? You spoke of Portolan charts. Where does the word Portolan come from?
Sure. So portolan comes from a word portolano, which was kind of a common word between Spanish and Portuguese and Italian, and those are the nations slash countries that made portolan charts. There were some from other places, but they were the ones that really made them in great numbers. So I honestly cannot remember at the moment what the origin of the word itself is. I knew that at some point, but I'm afraid it's fallen out of my head. But I'm happy to answer that. If you want to send an Ask a Librarian, I can look it up and get back to you. But the word itself, I know, refers to this particular kind of chart, kind of sailing chart, which, as I kind of mentioned, I know I went through this quickly, but as I mentioned, those kinds of charts came out of a tradition of only writing down where places were. This is why we don't find maps in ancient Greece, for example. People always ask about those and they don't exist, but it's because directions used to be written and then slowly people started to realize that they could kind of mathematically make it look something useful on paper. So portolans refer to that tradition. And again, that was for about 300 or 400 years that those were the most accurate kind of maps that existed. And some of them were very secret. Many of them have only been found by accident over the centuries because they were often considered state secrets early on, since being able to sail the world was a privilege that brought a lot of money with it for various nations. I think I saw someone over here. Okay. There. Hi.
Hi. Okay. I know you said that you had some fantasy map. Oh,
I think you're good.
oh okay. I know you guys had said that you had some fantasy maps. Do you guys have any Lord of the Rings maps?
We definitely do. Yes, I love the Lord of the Rings maps. We have some of the really fun ones from the 70s that were kind of the big run that a lot of people think of when they think of Lord of the Rings maps. And then, of course, some more commemorative ones more recently, especially with the movies. I think there was one here. And so we do have a number of those. And those also you can just come in and request. As long as you have a reader card, you can come into the library and ask for them.
On the fictional map train, what would you say is the most important aspect of making a fictional map feel realistic?
Ooh. I love that question, and I am so unqualified to answer it. I had the privilege earlier this year of sitting on a panel with Tim Paul, who's an illustrator who's made maps for a series like the Broken Earth trilogy and some other really recognizable fantasy games and not in books. So he's really he's the best authority that I know on that. And I think that he would probably talk about the fact that it has to kind of fit with the theme of the book, you know, as far as when he chooses colors, when he chooses the typography, all those kinds of details. He's definitely reading the books before he makes them and making an informed decision, as it were. But beyond that, the magic of what he does and how he makes it look great, I couldn't speak to it, unfortunately. But definitely, there are a lot of great map illustrators out there who I'm sure you can find their talks about it, and they would be better to answer.
Hi, thank you very much for your explanation. At the Vatican Museum, I saw ancient maps, Roman maps, and I was wondering if the Library of Congress could ever acquire maps from that era. Some of them were BCE, so much older than 1300. So they'd be very good, I think, for your collection.
If any of them ever come up for sale, I'm sure we'd be excited to try. So so that is something that comes up a lot. There are certain kinds of maps that are just not going to move. You know, we're never going to buy it from the Vatican. It doesn't really seem likely that they would sell anyway. So for maps like that, and then the maps, you know, I said that there aren't really maps of the ancient world, and of course there are exceptions to every rule. There are a few that are known, and so you've seen some examples. Many of those were not, we didn't have paper maps back then the way we do now, which is an important distinction as well. It's not that nobody ever tried to visualize anything in terms of where distances were. You know, you can find Babylonian, Sumerian maps, etc. They're just really different from, I kind of oversimplified, but they're really different from the traditions we start to see in around the 1300s, when maps actually try to be mathematically helpful for how to get between places, but certainly conceptualizing conceptualizing the Earth in image form exists before that. But yes, it's usually, it's kind of a supply thing. You know, we're not going to take things from institutions that already have them. But yes, if anybody ever finds another Roman map and wants to sell it to us, or better yet, donate it, you know, I mean, that would be great. We would certainly, I think, be thrilled.
Yeah, a little more modern question. How has GPS changed map making?
So We have several people on our staff, about a staff of about 30 in total. I'm one of the reference librarians. There's 5 of us, but we also have a team of cartographers. So they use GIS and they use things that are derived from GPS, satellites, etc. And they make maps for Congress. They don't make maps for the general public, so that's why you don't hear about them much. But if you've ever watched a presentation from a member of Congress that includes a map of their district and it's really beautifully made, that was probably someone on my team. So we do still very much enter into the business of map making, and we do collect modern maps and data. We collect a lot of data. Trying to make that more accessible to the public is often a kind of tricky business because some of it is not open to be shared with the public, but we do collect it for preservation purposes. But it's changed everything. Maps are still maps, but certainly we've had all kinds of new infrastructure and all kinds of new practices because of everything related to how satellites have changed maps and how computers have changed map making more generally.
I've noticed that even in my phone, it uses different types of maps. Like the Find My app uses a flat Mercator projection, while the Apple Maps uses a model of a globe. What's the difference in the pros and cons for using different kinds of maps for stuff like that?
Oh, interesting. So I'll try to answer, I'll give a short answer, and if you want to send it in and ask a librarian, we can nerd out and send you some links. But the shortest answer I can give you is that some are better for navigation, some are better for understanding general shapes and distances at a truer, so kind of a truer how many miles are between Moscow and China, or sorry, Moscow and like Chicago or something would be a different thing than what's the best way to navigate around the coast of South America, right? There would be different things that you would want to know depending on the purpose. So historically, that's a reason why certain projections were favored. And then as far as why they show up in different ways on your phone, I honestly don't know. I'm sure that there are people at Apple and people at Google and everywhere else who are really interested in what map projections they particularly like, and I'm not friends with them, so I don't know that, but I would love to know for sure. If you ever find out, let me know. I think we had a question up here at the front who's been waiting a while. Oh, okay, we can now after that one. Okay.
All right, I'll keep it quick. With respect to fictional maps, I know that in publication history there have been many times that a map has been re-illustrated for a different version of a book or whatever. Have you ever interrogated that, or do you know anyone who's ever interrogated that in the same historical aspect that you might with a real-world map?
So are you referring to something like how Lord of the Rings maps get published more than once, just as time goes on?
Yeah, how they might be redrawn or rewritten, and how you might look into that in the same way that we look into historic maps and what you were referring to with, what people want to emphasize with respect to the story or the world.
Sure, yeah, certainly. So I think some of that can definitely come down to artistic sensibility, same as certain styles of painting are popular in one century or one decade versus another. I think that's definitely part of it. And again, I think it comes down to, as you were kind of hinting with your answer, it comes down to the sensibility over what's important to emphasize, because maybe there's an illustrator who thought this one particular part of the story didn't get well shown on the map in a previous time versus now, and that is definitely a good parallel with historic map making in general. I gave the African Union example since that's just been in the news, and it's very handy when map stuff is in the news and I can prove that it's important. But of course, there are plenty of stories over the years that people have told about this city never showed up in these old maps and it's a really important city, etc. So I think all kinds of things like that, if that answers your question.
Thank you. You've talked a little bit about acquisitions, but just more broadly, given the sheer volume of materials that are being generated and lack of space, even when you're got digital, how do you decide what to come in, what comes in, what to keep? I mean, obviously you get donations, but beyond that, what guidelines do you use?
Sure. So that's another one of those things that if you send us an Ask a Librarian, I can send you a lot of really boring text for if you have trouble sleeping and you want to read through. But the general policy that we follow is that if there are holes in the collection, if there are places, time periods that are not well represented, especially if we're getting questions about them from patrons, or even more so questions from Congress about them, that is priority number one. We're going to want to fill in those gaps. And recently, how that has mainly looked is that we have been wanting to fill in more indigenous knowledge knowledge in our collections. And as I mentioned, the tricky part about that is that it's European map-making traditions that have made the map collections we have. But where we are able to go around the world and get different kinds of maps, including from within our own country's borders, so to speak, then that is something that we emphasize for sure. And also we want to be good stewards of those materials. And also, yes, anything digital that's going to be really high use and high priority, that is certainly, because it's 2025, something that we focus on. But yeah, so definitely anything that fills in the gaps that we think is good for research value, that is always our primary goal, is research value, then that's the sort of general broad strokes of how we collect.
Hi. So using that first map that was Maine and Northeast Canada, I was just curious, does the Library of Congress have a division that works with other countries about items that may have generated from other countries?
Yes, we do. I actually love working with them. We have what's called the overseas offices. They're in a few different places, and I actually work with the office that's in Rio de Janeiro, and because my family's Brazilian, so I asked for that one, is the short version for why. But there are different offices around the world that collect materials for us from countries where we may not have as good of just as good of knowledge of what's coming out of their libraries, what's coming out of their presses, what their government agencies are working on. So we have local people who will go in and do these multi-country trips in the region to pick materials for us, and that's been very fruitful and very helpful. I've actually been working on a project recently to acquire more charts of the coastline of Brazil, for example, which of course is very important to a lot of people now, whether it's for industrial reasons, preservation reasons of coastline, etc. So definitely lots of examples like that, but that's just a favorite.
Earlier, you alluded to members of Congress being interested in certain periods of history or historical maps. I'm curious what form that might take and what their interest might be.
Sure. I don't think I'm allowed to give you specifics, but I can definitely tell you that, as you might expect, any member of Congress is going to be interested in their own district. They want to know what it's looked like over the course of history. It's important for them to know, and also just fun. If they haven't seen an old map, even if they're very familiar with newer stuff, they might have never seen a map that was made in 1810 of their district, and so that's usually very exciting for them and for their staff. Also, sometimes they just have kind of general world history interest, whether or not, we're not told whether it's related to policy, but that they're working on, but sometimes just general interest in places that have been in the news or places in the world that maybe their families are from. So it can be all kinds of things, pretty similar to the general public, really, but also definitely they like seeing their district. Okay.
Do you have collections of underwater map, like famous sites like the Titanic or where the Bismarck went down or the Marianas Trenches?
So we do have underwater maps. We have bathymetric maps that go into detail of the coastline, and then we do have some maps that show kind of wider areas that are underwater. So if you're familiar with Marie Tharp and Bruce Hazen, for example, we have their papers and their maps, which was what, for anybody who doesn't know, those were the scientists who proved the existence of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is the underwater volcano range in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So we have things like that. Now, as far as if we have specific maps of sites like where the Titanic is, I have not seen one. I'm not sure that we do. It's possible, but I think that was somewhat guarded information, at least for a while, so I'm not sure if we ever got that. As far as like the specific maps of where to find it. Of course, now people know, but for a while, I don't think that was public, and so I'm not totally sure that we got maps at the time. We do get a lot of maps from government agencies as they're produced. That's one of the big ways that our collection has grown. But that is a good one for Ask a Librarian, because I'd be happy to dig into that if you want to send in a question. And I saw the 2-minute warning a while ago. I'm not sure if we have time for any more questions. Is that, should we we have one more question. Okay.
Hi, thank you. One short question, one longer question. What is your favorite projection? And you mentioned collecting data as part of your job. What types of data do you collect?
Well, I love that question about the projection. I'm a big fan of the Winkle Triple, personally. I think it's a really nice one, and I really love how about 6 people just went. So yeah, great crowd. All right, yes, I love that one. And my husband actually made a stained glass design of the Winkle Triple projection for me while we were still dating, and that's how I knew I wanted to marry him. So yeah, he's a good guy. So yeah. I know, right? And so to your next question. So as far as types of data, we get all kinds of things related to kind of pretty much any reason people make maps, we probably collect it. So things that are related to mining, things that are related to soil, things that might be for agriculture, et cetera. But also things from space, as you heard, we definitely love getting data from and about space when we can, although that stuff takes a lot of storage. So really pretty much anything. I've been told I gotta cut us off here, so I'm afraid that's about it. But if you want to know more about that, you can definitely find more on our website, and you're always welcome if you're looking for specific types of data to send in a question on Ask a Librarian. So I think that's where I have to leave you folks for today, but thank you. You've been a lovely audience.